Horatio said was, how can a man die better than facing fearful odds?
Move! Get inside! Get inside!
For the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods.
I created you, Jack. I am your god.
Fuck you, Sally.
This is Aeon by Gnostic Radio, broadcast at the virtual Alexandria, always through the GodAboveGod.com. I am Abraxas, that terrible God above God as the ancients knew him, and orthodoxy fears him more than ever in this veil of tears and boredom we call our lives.
Luminous beings, Zoe, not this crude matter.
I come to you in my meat machine incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting on this January, the year of our Demiurge 2016, from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. That's as arousing as I will get today, for a darksome reason. This program is dedicated to the memory of my dearest of friends, Acharya S or DM Murdoch. She recently lost her battle to breast cancer, ironically leaving her material form on Christmas Day. Acharya left a much poorer world. She also left a 13-year-old son that I pray for deeply, and left all of us a wondrous body of work on comparative mythology, ancient religion, and pink beam activism that will forever be an Archon killer in all times and places. But I miss the kind and generous and funny person who was Acharya, my friend and mentor. Farewell for now.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share. Undimmed by time, unbound by death.
I remember seeing Acharya's work in 2001, given to me by my best friend and soulmate, Sajjad. Sajjad, the black label drinking Sufi, would die shortly during the war in Afghanistan. But that's another story. Sajjad handed me some photocopied pages of the Christ conspiracy, and it immediately instilled an alchemical nuclear reaction. I felt I could breathe theologically for the first time in my existence. I was a heterodox Roman Catholic back then, but seeing her work stirred an ancient spark in me, the light of mythopoeia that is nothing but a public dream of humanity, attempting to understand and renovate itself. Put simply, I was transformed. A few years later, I was devouring the entire Christ conspiracy and Sons of God in a coffee shop in Chicago, while the Demiurge sent out a blizzard outside in warning. But I kept reading for hours, later buying more of her works, and soon kept asking her to come on Aeon by Gnostic Radio. She was one of my first guests, back when it was called Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, and never stopped elevating this alternative media with august appearances.
You are the reason I still have faith.
Acharya once told me she considered herself a Gnostic. Not in the way of accepting we live in a false reality, pregnant with archons and aeons. No, but in the way knowledge was the key to liberation in this world. Like the ancient heretics, an understanding of religion, myth, and sociology granted an individual the catalyst to unlock unlimited potential and a purpose in life. Like me and Theodotus, Acharya knew that this special knowledge, this gnosis, was just any information that makes you free. Indeed, Acharya will always be the ultimate Gnostic. And like the ancient heretics, so many orthodoxies attempted to silence her while she broke so many chains of censorship and demolished established historical and cultural norms.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
More than a Gnostic, Acharya was a good person, a kind person, a good mother and teacher. For all of this and more, Acharya, you will never age for me, and you will never be forgotten. This show is dedicated to the memory of Acharya S, and this show could never thrive without her as one of its demigoddesses. Not much else I can say, and so much I wish I could say. I'm sure many of you feel this way.
Look at us. I'm frozen and you're dead.
Someone I know will have even more sapient things to say about Acharya is our guest in this eternal yet sorrowful now. That is Robert M. Price, who was actually the first ever guest on the show, right before Acharya. He was also her friend and a collaborator, and along with Acharya, he is one of my favorite scholars. Beyond discussing Acharya, Bob will also be discussing his new book, Moses and Minimalism. This new book truly deconstructs the figure of Moses and places him in the hollowed pantheon of most other biblical figures. A myth in the ever-making, basically. A patchwork of characters like you and I are, really.
If there is a God, he did not mean this to be so.
For more information on Bob, please visit robertprice.mindvendor.com. And check out many past interviews with the Bible Geek, as Bob is known as, found at our YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, and subscription channels. Before the interview with Bob on Moses and Minimalism, please consider donating to Acharya's family. Her immediate family is in need of support to cover funeral and hospital costs. You can donate by purchasing her ebooks at stellarhouseppublishing.com/acharyapdfs.html. Again, that is stellarhouseppublishing.com/acharyapdfs.html. Or send me an email if you need some help. Her family will get 100% of your donation, and you will receive digital copies of her great ebooks. Let us to the interview with Robert Price on Moses. Write your own gospel and live your own myth. Just like Dorothy did.
You see, I believe that when we leave a place, part of it goes with us, and part of us remains. Go anywhere in the station, and it is quiet, and just listen. After a while, you will hear the echoes of all our conversations, every thought and word we've exchanged. Long after we are gone, our voices will linger in these walls, for as long as this place remains. But I will admit that the part of me that is going will very much miss the part of you that is staying.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure having back, as always, Robert Price, a.k.a. the Bible Geek. How you doing today, Bob?
Oh, terrific.
Glad that you're back. Glad that you're here in the lands of the Gnostic. And before we get started, we'll be discussing your book, Moses and Minimalism, Form Criticism versus Fiction in the Pentateuch. Some of you know we had the passing of our dear friend Acharya S on Christmas Day. And Bob and myself, along with a August group of individuals, including David Fitzgerald and Aaron Ra, and of course Sean and Fritz from Mythicist Milwaukee, we were on the Mythicist Milwaukee podcast doing a show about Acharya and her contributions and how she affected our life. For those of you interested, you can go to mythicistmilwaukee.com and check out their podcast and radio section where you can find, listen to a copy of this group interview that we did. So since then, Bob, as now that the dust have settled, how are you feeling about the passing of Acharya?
Well, as is cliche to say, it sort of came as a shock. I suppose the initial shock of hearing that she had the cancer was even more of a blow, but the other shoe inevitably dropped, and so sad. She was an amazing woman.
Agreed, and also for those interested in helping out her family in this time of need, the Mythicist Milwaukee website has ways you can contribute to Acharya. And it's interesting, I also wanted to mention from that group discussion, we talked about how Acharya was a bit peeved about your review of the Christ conspiracy, and I probably should have crystallized it better, but when she was, so you might say irate or angry, really you, Bob, were the catalyst, because she told me that she would wanted to write this time write a very good scholarly type book. And I think that's what happened, because after that she wrote Who Was Jesus?, who I think is one of her best books. It's very tight. It reminds me a lot of Randall Helm's Gospel Fiction, or Earl Doherty's, what's the name of Earl's book?
The Jesus Puzzle, was the first and shorter one.
Yeah, the shorter one, which I find is the better one. So in a way, you and she always also complained because Who Was Jesus was really her lowest selling book. She went on to write Christ in Egypt. She had to sort of bring back more of the esoteric thing to sell some copies. But
yeah, I guess so. Wow.
Yeah, so you were, in a way, a catalyst. And what do you think of her book, Who Was Jesus?
I think it is good. You described it well already. Concise and clear, and bringing up a lot of the major points, and less esoteric, though, of course, by contrast with what most people think and believe and read. That would be enough to, like Kant said, jolt them out of a dogmatic slumber. I thought she did a good job on it.
She also talked about, for years, doing a second edition of the Christ conspiracy. Did she ever approach you about help or ideas or anything like that?
No, though I have been approached since she became gravely ill, I think by friends who work on the website with it, I'm not absolutely sure, and by her ex-husband or whatever he was. I don't know if they were actually married or what, but it looks like I probably will finish it up, because as I understand it, she had written most of it, and so if I can be of any help, I'd consider it a great honor and a kind of positive irony to be able to do it. It's funny that in just I think a beautifully ironic way that my review of the first edition ignited so many sparks, and when I eventually became friends with her, she admitted to me that she felt like she that it was a salutary rebuke, and I could tell from all of her books afterward that she really had improved in her methodology and the soundness of her arguments. It sort of started out in a rocky way, but it may be ending up in a friendly, posthumous collaboration, and that's probably the greatest honor I could do her, and it certainly is a great honor for me to participate in any way, even if it's just proofreading the footnotes.
It's also, well, somewhat not ironic, but synchronistic that she put out Did Moses Exist last year? No, it's last year. And, well, you the same have put out Moses and Minimalism. And they're both great books. I think that Moses Exists really goes where no scholar has gone, especially with archaeology and ancient mythology. So
yeah, in fact, that's why in the beginning of I was in touch with her while it was going on, and I had a pretty good idea, even before it came out, of what she was doing, and it was most impressive. And in the beginning of, I guess, the introduction to my book, I suggested that anybody reading this book read hers, and that you might even consider mine a kind of an appendix to hers. I was pleased to be associated with her even there.
So comparing to the two books, what exactly separates your book from Acharya's book on Moses?
Well, she has this, like you mentioned, the archaeology, which I don't get into much except to say that it forces us into the minimalist camp, that there's just no evidence for an exodus, etc. It cannot have happened. But beyond that, she goes into much detail, and I guess the real bulk of it is this fantastic survey of comparative mythology. Like, I just was utterly ignorant of the link between Dionysus and Moses. And, I mean, that wasn't my approach anyway, but I couldn't have done it. I didn't know that stuff. And so there is, I would suggest people check out both, though, as Thomas L. Thompson, who's really the king of the Old Testament minimalists in many ways, said that the mythical nature of Moses is really taken for granted by the scholarly establishment these days. So what I'm doing is kind of popularizing some of that scholarship in the same way I received it. I was really an outsider. I'm not an Old Testament scholar, and it came as a great revelation to me to read what these people had, like Thompson, had come up with. And so I'm just like the old fundamentalist analogy for evangelism, one beggar telling others where to find food. And it just fascinated me utterly. And but that, in a sense, Acharya and I were just trying to play catch up with what they knew in the hallowed halls of academia.
And for those who might not know, Bob, what exactly is minimalism in the scholarly world?
It's still controversial, but I think is much more powerful. A lot of arguments have been won, and the basic notion is that far from the view promoted by W.F. Albright and his disciples a few decades ago, the Old Testament story is not confirmed by archaeology, as one still hears ad nauseum from apologists for the Bible. Oh, don't you see, the story's historical, they've discovered this and that. It turns out that's not the case, it's just the opposite. What Albright and his generation of biblical archaeologists did was not much different from what Constantine's Queen Mother did when she sent people over to the Holy Land to discover, quote unquote, the true cross and the empty tomb and all of these things. You just sort of like pin the tail on the Bible and tried to find, well, granted that they're taken for granted that there is such a thing as an empty tomb and a true cross and all that stuff. What's the best candidate for it? And that's completely circular. And what Thompson and a bunch of others did was to say, let's just put the Bible on the shelf for the moment and see what an inductive scrutiny of the archaeology of the Holy Land would yield. And it turns out there's, for instance, no real trace of a Davidic empire, of a Temple of Solomon, of a Palace of David. There's no real indication that there was a kingdom of Judah until very late, and that you had Israel predating Judah, and there was never a united monarchy, and so on down the line. The stories of the patriarchs are not based, or do not jive with what is known about the supposedly the social arrangements of the time they would have lived, and so on down the line. That it, in short, that virtually the whole Old Testament story is legendary, if not mythical. Toward the later parts of it, you do coincide with history. Some of the northern Israelite kings are mentioned, the house of Omri, but that says nothing about the, mentioned in extra-biblical sources. I like to say the least interesting part of the Bible story has some connection with history, but all the fantastic stuff and even the existence of some of these characters is so unlikely. I mean, again, no Exodus. Like, how are you going to explain the absence of any sign of that mass population move? There have been about three, at least, major theories of the routes taken by the Israelites from Egypt. Pick any one you want. You can use aerial photography and heat sensing and so forth to pick up things like that, like to discover 1,000-year-old caravan trails in the Arabian Peninsula. But whatever you use, there is just no evidence of a massive move of over 1 million people, and it just cannot have happened unless you think that right afterward God sent down a cleanup crew of angels with vacuum cleaners. I mean, it really is on the level with the nonsense that, well, there weren't any dinosaurs, Satan planted the bones to deceive us. You really have to go that far. And it's the same way with the Solomonic temple. It just doesn't seem to have existed. It's like, what would have happened to it? How could there not be any evidence of it? A couple of people have said, oh, look at this, here's a ceramic pomegranate, literally, that could have been used, since it's said that they had pomegranate designs in the temple. Well, this thing's been a lot of doubt has been cast on its authenticity and on many supposed archaeological discoveries that they're just forgeries. But even if you had the one, it's the exception that proves the rule. Why just that? And the same thing with the Quran and the idea, at least it's the way it's been interpreted, about Muhammad and the Quraysh clan in Mecca, which was a major trading center. There's no evidence for that, and there'd have to be. And even in the New Testament, it's a little bit more plausible, the frame of reference, but as you know, there's this huge problem of no apparent Galilean synagogues in the first century. What the heck happened? Did they just meet in Boy Scout camps or something? I mean, it just, minimalism means it looks like it's all fictional or legendary or both.
Yeah, you mentioned one part in your book, or you quote somebody, I believe a theologian, who says that if you would put the Hebrews, the Israelites, in a line of 50 shoulder to shoulder, they'd be like 22 miles long and would just consume the whole desert.
Yeah, that was, I think, Bishop Colenso, who really got into huge trouble. He sat down to do the math, as they say, and he just found, given the size of the population that's given in Exodus, and the number of priests and the number of lambs that had to be sacrificed by everybody, even back then, you'd have to have the very few priests sacrificing loads of lambs every minute and so forth. And nobody ever thought to actually put the numbers together. It's just transparently a kind of historicizing of much later rituals and structures. And that alone, forget about archaeology, has been enough to explode this whole thing for a couple of 100 years.
And going to the figure of Moses, in her book, Did Moses Exist? She talks about, and as you mentioned this, Moses is basically another form of Dionysus, that sort of a wine god of freedom, or whatever. But you mentioned that Moses is more akin to a sun god, a solar logos. Why is that, Bob?
Well, in Greek mythology and over in Babylon, you have, and I think other places too, you have the laws promulgated, I guess the word is, by some great lawgiver who is associated with the sun god or is the sun god. For instance, in Greece, Apollo was the sun god, and he was the one who gave the laws. It's not absolutely clear why there would be that connection, but there was. And on the huge inscription of the great tablet of the Code of Hammurabi, the Emperor Hammurabi is standing there receiving that very code from Shamash, the sun god. And those are just two real good examples, and the Bible is filled with sun gods. The clues are so hard to miss, like Samson, whose name simply means the sun, and he has the long hair, which symbolizes the sun's rays, and when they're cut off, he's also blinded and weakened. Well, it's like on a cloudy day, you can't see the sun, and it's neither bright nor warm, and so the sun has lost its strength. He destroys the Philistine grain harvest by releasing foxes that he set on fire. Well, I used to see that all the time in the farmland area I lived in, where every summer the corn stalks would just be reduced to crepe paper by the sun. And there are various other gimmicks. The killing of a lion. It's just like Hercules, who killed the Nemean lion and wore its mane because of the long hair symbolizing the sun. Elijah was a sun god. He's described as a hairy man, though the translators clean it up saying he was wearing a hair shirt or something. But it actually says a hairy man. And what does he do? He calls down fire from heaven to burn people. How does he make his exit? Aboard a flaming horse-drawn chariot carrying him into the sky, and so forth. The Enoch, 365 years, a reference to the solar calendar. He rises into heaven and walks across the firmament with God. Like, what else do you need? Even like Jacob is a sun god, and the various other ones with greater or lesser hints. But Moses, boy, does he fit the type. It's just as Psalm, I believe, 19 refers to the sun coming out rejoicing as a bridegroom from his chamber, his tent. Well, how's Moses described? He comes out of the tent of meeting with his face glowing so that he has to cover it up so as not to freak everybody out, and he's bearing laws. And and when you look at his so-called biography, there's really nothing that hasn't been borrowed from the Jacob stories, or that is simply a fictive legal precedent for this or that law. And it's a little surprising. It's the same problem with Jesus. You would think if this is an important historical figure, you'd know something about their life, but instead you have just stories where they're used as part of an object lesson or conspicuous parallels with other myths of the time. So it seems very unlikely that there was any historical Moses.
And what about the famous trope of him coming down with horns? Michelangelo depicted him that way. What is your take on that? There's been debate about it.
It's because of the ambiguity of a Hebrew word, because you'd need to know more of the context to see what it's supposed to mean. It could mean horns, which are projections, or rays, and it certainly means rays there, because he covers his face until the glow subsides and so on. And I don't know how they ignored the context, unless they were trying to suppress the notion of Moses as the sun god, though horns are not much better, I suppose.
Very true. Going on why Moses is there, and we've talked before how the Gnostics in a lot of their scriptures, like the Sethian sort of, it seems in the secret book of John, they sort of just tacked him on at the end or added him in. In your book, you also say that Moses might have not even been a character in the beginning. It was all about the priests and the plagues, and again, he was just sort of tacked on at the end.
Yes, that certainly seems to be true of Aaron in the same stories, where he's an attempt to read in the authority of the later institution of the high priest back in and give them, the priests, a retrospective pedigree equal to Moses, though Moses was at some point symbolic of the institution of the priest kings, where the same person occupied both offices. But Moses himself, and this was apparent to Martin Note, the great Old Testament critic in the pre-minimalistic times, earlier in the 20th century, about the middle of the 20th century. He came up with this redundancy principle, where he says if there are seemingly superfluous characters in the story, like when Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu all go up to have a feast in the presence of God and then see God, what the heck are Nadab and Abihu in there for? I mean, the only other thing we ever really hear about him is that they get roasted by the wrath of God for some error in offering the incense. What are they doing there? And he says, well, it makes the most sense that the story was originally about them, but they didn't really go anywhere as important characters, so they simply added more important ones, Moses and Aaron. Of course, they could have just omitted them, but people were familiar with the stories, and they'd be more upset if it'd be more noticeable if you said, hey, well, where the heck's Nadab and Abihu? That's the way I always heard it. It's easier to get folks to accept it if you simply add other figures. Oh, well, okay, kind of a harmonization. And so Note went on to show that that most of these stories involving Moses imply he isn't even essential to them. That, for instance, all the complaint stories and so on in the wilderness, that the people murmur before God and he responds. You don't really need Moses as the middleman, though he's later, or in the form we read, he's in there, and he says one big clue to this is that there is one story in the beginning of Exodus where Moses and Aaron don't even appear before Pharaoh. They're just in the waiting lounge outside, waiting to hear how the negotiation between Pharaoh and the Israelite elders turns out. That's really odd. And he says that's just a case of, I guess, what Mark Goodacre now calls editorial fatigue. Just missed one. In changing these stories to magnify Moses, one slipped through the net. And Note figured that kind of called the tune for all the ones in which Moses is central. He isn't really necessary, but once he was introduced, and I would say once the sun god Moses was historicized, you had to find a place for him, and so he becomes central. It's sort of like Judas Iscariot in the Gospels. Why do you really need this guy in terms of the narrative? Do they need to identify Jesus in a crowd? That can't be, because the whole reason they're arresting him is that he's so popular that the reason they're arresting him on the sly is that he's so popular, if they nabbed him in public, there'd be rioting. So certainly there can't be any problem. Which one of you guys is Jesus? Judas came into the story because somebody misunderstood God delivering over paradidomi, his son, for us as the other meaning of that, to betray. So Jesus wasn't simply handed over, that is, by God. He was betrayed by somebody, so there needs to be a betrayer, and that's probably what Iscariot means, the man of falsehood. So it's the same sort of thing with Moses. He's really a fifth wheel. What do you need him for? Why is he in there? A place had to be made for him. And, of course, in the case of Judas, part of it's just misconstruing that word, and part of it is to heap blame on Jews.
Most people who've read mythology and start getting into this stuff, the minimalism, as you say, know that Moses, the story of the basket, is probably based on, I believe, Sumerian king Sargon. But Bob,
the Assyrian Sargon,
right.
Almost exactly. It's astounding, the similarity. But there are other ones, too, like Perseus, who's set adrift to get rid of him, but by divine providence, he's a demigod, and he becomes a savior. And Oedipus is similar, and Romulus and Remus, and so on and so forth. So it's a kind of a common type, but the parallel with Sargon is the most pronounced.
Well, maybe he looked like Harry Hamlin. Who knows?
Could be. Yeah, it looks familiar.
But what about the name Moses? What does it mean for those who might not know or know the story from their churches?
Well, it seems to be an attempt to... Freud speculated. He thought there was a historical Moses. Most folks did back then. And they tried to take most of it, as much as they could, as literal history, but then tried to supply unsuspected causes in the background of the story. Well, in this case, you figure there was a Moses, and he was in Egypt until he led the Exodus and so forth. But he was an Egyptian. The story of his being found in the river was that was borrowed, but there was a Moses, and he was an Egyptian, and they tried to hide that later on. Well, he was pretty close to what I think is the truth, namely that the name Moses is half of an Egyptian royal name. These guys, the pharaohs, were all supposed to be demigods, that the wife of the current pharaoh was impregnated by a god, and he'd be named. The kid would be named for that. Like Ramses means Ra has begotten him. Ra-Meses, or Tutmos, with Thutmos is spelled, means Thoth has begotten him. Tutmos, and there's Amos and other ones. Well, this is just the same name without the divine prefix, as they say, the theophoric element, the God-bearing element of the name. And it was no doubt an Egyptian god, because you wouldn't be using the Mos syllable if it wasn't. And so when they decided to bring in that material, the Hebrew storytellers had to change the name. They didn't like the idea that the founder of the Jewish religion was either an Egyptian or had an Egyptian name. That'd be like calling him Heinrich or something. You wouldn't want to do that, so they figured, now, what Hebrew word could be preserved in his name, which meant what Hebrew word sounds kind of like Moshe or Moses. And they said, well, how about the word Masha, to draw out of? And that's probably what led to the adoption of the Sargon myth, because it says they named him Moses because he was drawn out of the Nile. I mean, if it's a naming thing, it has to be in connection with the kid being a baby very early. And okay, so then what might this baby, what event could have been, it could have led to his commemoration with this fairly mundane word? Well, if he owed his life to being drawn out of the Nile, that would have done it. And so it's a Hebrew name, never mind the fact that the daughter of Pharaoh is hardly likely to have given him a Hebrew name, even though she knew he was Hebrew. But it's many of these naming stories in the Old Testament are puns trying to explain or re-explain a name that now didn't cut the mustard anymore. Like my favorite example of that would be Gideon, who was also called Jerubbaal, and that has to have meant, may Baal fight for him. And it's like Isaac, he laughs or he smiles, or may he smile, which would have been, that would have implied, may God smile on him and give him a good life. Well, that's been forgotten, and so we have about 6 different stories about why he's named he laughs. But back to Gideon, he was named because they were invoking the blessing of Baal to fight on his behalf throughout his life. But they stopped worshiping Baal, or they stopped calling Jehovah Baal, the title Lord, because of the Baal worship that they're always inveighing against. So what are you going to do with this story? Well, okay, how about this? God appears to him and tells him to smash the idol of Baal, and so he does strike a blow against heathenism. And the next morning, when they find out what he's done, they gather at Gideon's house, his family house, and demand that the kid be turned over to him. And Gideon's father, or Jerubbaal's father, comes out and says, what, this God needs palookas like you to protect him? No, let Baal contend for himself. That's why he was called Jerubbaal. Let Baal fight his own battles. But he can't, obviously. And so the story, I'm way off the field on this, but there are loads of stories about this where names are redefined in a more orthodox way from a later standpoint. And Moses is just one of the many of these things. It shows great ingenuity, though it's kind of slightly dishonest. Or at least it shows the fictional character of it, and implies that the people that pulled this kind of stunt understood it was fictional.
Bob, many people who still accept the idea of Moses and the Israelites being a myth still cling on to the idea, or at least the notion, that at one point the Hebrews were slaves in some way or another with the Egyptians. But as you point out, that might have never even happened in any way. They were just sort of writing about bad guys in a distant land.
Yeah, it's not like there was never any problem with foreign conquerors and all that. That's for sure. But even the idea of the Babylonian exile and the return from it is a kind of an artificial construct based simply on the dispersion of Israelites when Assyria conquered them, but also just travelers and colonists, what we call the diaspora or the dispersion today. But in the Babylonian exile, myth was trumped up to feather the nest of the people like Ezra that came back as Persian functionaries to redesign Israelite government and faith as part of their empire. Well, the same sort of thing happened with the Exodus in Egypt. It seems like in order to differentiate the Hebrew people from the so-called Canaanites, when in fact all of the Hebrews simply were Canaanites, like the Jebusites and the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Midianites, and all these guys. They were all related. Even the stories of the patriarchs admit that the Lot, the father of this group, and Ishmael, the father of that group, they were all in a tight family tree. So you still have the smoking gun indicating they were all ethnically the same people, but much later interests, the folks that streamlined the whole religion, the so-called Deuteronomic reformers, they wanted to push Jewish monotheism and the Torah way back to the founding period of Moses. so that they could say that all the polytheism and idolatry that everybody knew had been evident in Hebrew religion from the beginning could still be understood as heathenism and an importation from these alien Canaanites, that the Israelites didn't really belong with them. It was just that once God gave them the land and brought them back, quote unquote, from Egypt, they got tempted to follow this pagan syncretism. And I mean, that seems odd. God expelled or exterminated all the Canaanites, didn't he? Well, if you look close at Joshua and the book of Judges, no such thing happened. I mean, they're different stories, and the idea of this blitzkrieg that eradicated all the pagans, it's debunked in the very next book. But that was part of the idea, to say God kicked them out to give us the land. We have the title to it, but we came back into it as conquerors, and sadly their descendants did what Moses had told them not to do, and mixed in with those heathen who were somehow still there, like Pharaoh's cattle. They kept getting killed 2 or 3 times, and so that darn it, we can't deny most Israelites were worshiping Baal and Astarte and all that stuff alongside Jehovah, but it was because they were perverting their religion. It was sort of like terrorists and jihadists aren't really Muslims. They're really just distorting the whole thing. And so the same thing there. Had they remained faithful to it, they'd believe what Orthodox rabbis did in the 2nd century BCE, because they should have believed it. They had Moses and the prophets telling them, but no, that's just revisionist history. And that's the point of the Exodus, to say we had nothing to do with those people. We remotely connected genealogically, but these people really grew up in Egypt for hundreds of years, and they were an alien, foreign element that got assimilated. And of course, another element of that is to push the Jewish diaspora across the Mediterranean back into Mosaic times. That was the real concern, that Jews that lived among Gentiles didn't start worshiping Marduk and Zeus, and they just slightly thinly veiled it under an Old Testament context, where so they worship Baal and Dagon, but they knew better. No, that was their religion.
And what most, also, a lot of people, or most people, and I was one of them, really get their idea of Moses mostly from movies instead of actually reading the text, and also, of course, going to school and church and so forth. But there's a lot of things many people miss, like, for example, and you point this out in your book, Moses and Minimalism, when you have the burning bush, there's actually an angel there talking to Moses. And I had to remember that. What is going on there, Bob?
Well, that, I think, shows also the lateness of the story. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's supposed to be God himself. I am has sent you and all that stuff. But later on, it says it was an angel. What is this? It's just like some of these other stories with Hagar and others, where the angel of Yahweh appears to them, or Samson's mother, various ones. And then afterward, they'll say, "Have I really seen Yahweh and lived to tell it?" Wait a minute, I thought it was just the angel of. Well, of course, it's possible that by that they mean something like the avatar of. That could be. But the slight variance in terminology within the same story implies that an old story is being retold from this Deuteronomic standpoint, where you have a much more transcendent idea of God. Wait a minute. God couldn't have actually been located in the burning bush. I mean, earlier people had no trouble with that, but they said, no, it was an angel. It was the same thing that made some later Jews say that it wasn't really God who directly gave the Torah. It was angels. You have that in Acts 6 in Stephen's speech, and in the Epistle to the Hebrews, and then big time in Galatians and Gnosticism afterward, only they were trying to oppose the real God with the giving of the law. But still, the Deuteronomic idea of transcendence is a big step on the way to that. In the same way, earlier stories about the temple said that God lived there. He was enthroned atop the Ark of the Covenant. But in later ones, you find, even within the same book, they're all patchwork quilts of earlier and later material. Later on, you hear that he has caused his name to dwell there, and so on. Like, what's the idea? They can't just replace the stories. They're too well known and venerated for that, so they have to tweak it here and there. I think the same thing happened in the Gospel of John in chapter 14, when Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be sufficient. And he says, Philip, have I been with you so long, and you still don't recognize me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Well, then suddenly we have, or don't you believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, whatever that means. It's like somebody said, oh, holy mackerel, wait a minute. Jesus isn't the Father. That's modalism. And so the text gets tinkered with to make it seem more orthodox. Bart Ehrman shows in his great book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, how the same thing happened with copyists. Boy, I don't like the way that sounds. That could aid and abet Gnosticism. Let's change it. And sometimes it didn't make it into all the copies, but some copyists left it in, and you can connect the dots. And you can do that all over the Bible. It's just theological revisionism.
Bob, have you seen the latest Moses movie, Exodus, Gods and Kings?
I saw most of it, then I realized I was late picking up my daughter and left right before the end, but I could see where it was going. I thought it was pretty bad. They couldn't decide whether they wanted to go with a psychologizing rationalism or just go full-blown myth, which is why Charlton Heston's The Ten Commandments is by far better. There they just pulled out all the stops, and that's the way the Bible has it. And when you cut it down to size, it's just neither fish nor fowl. It's just half baked, and I just thought it was. Plus, it was edited in a terrible way. Like Joshua in this one, whom I call Pink Mania, because he was played by the guy that played Jesse Pinkman. He like has no role in it because most of it's on the cutting room floor thanks to cinematic redactors. But that kind of thing happened in the Bible too. They just chopped some stuff out clumsily. But I thought it was really grossly disappointing.
Yeah, well, I like how they show Yahweh, or I thought it was Yahweh, as this sort of petulant little child, but I believe Ridley Scott later said he was actually an angel, so at least he was sort of getting that right, and I guess the miracles, they tried to make it into more, you might say, scientific, and you yourself, right, that's what people have tried, make the plagues scientific and logical.
Yeah, which its note said that seemed to come from a slightly distanced set of rumors about what happens repeatedly in connection with the flooding of the Nile. But it seems to me that he's being too generous to it. It's like the people that wrote the three different versions of the plague stories had no idea of how things were in Egypt, or they wouldn't have, like, this is all misunderstanding, it seems to me. But there is an element of rationalism in the Exodus story with the locust plague, where it actually says that the locusts were driven off their usual flight path by a change in the winds. And similarly, it says, it doesn't go into all the stuff that people try to connect the dots and explain every element of it as scientific, but also the drying up of the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea. That's a translation error in the Septuagint. But the Sea of Reeds dries up. Why? Because God said, let there be a dried up sea? No, it doesn't say that. It says a stiff east wind blowing all night caused the water to retreat and the marsh to dry up. And that is an example of what I think that marks at least that layer of the story is very late. It's actually showing signs of Greek rationalism from the Hellenistic period. And so there is a bit of that, but most of it in the three traditional streams, the J, E, and P version, these guys had no idea what the conditions would have been like. It may have been kind of based on it, but it's like the Star of Bethlehem in Matthew. If it really was a nova or a conjunction of planets or something, then Matthew is wrong, not right, because he says it was a moving star. And it's the same thing here, that if you rationalize it, you've not vindicated the accuracy of the Bible, you've debunked it as not even supposed to be miraculous anymore. Interesting, but not what they claim for it.
And outside of the Ten Commandments, do you have any other two favorite Moses movies?
I don't really care for any I've seen. I thought the Burt Lancaster version in 74, 75 was awful because they tried to bring it down to earth. Same problem, though. It didn't lurch from one implausibility to another like the Christian Bale version did. And this is so surprising that when I went to see the Noah movie with Russell Crowe, I thought it was going to be the same nonsense, but that was a fascinating and ingenious movie which didn't spare the miracles. They just got them from a wider database, the various pseudepigrapha and rabbinic legends and so on. But not this. I thought this was really clever in some ways, but not enough to redeem the movie.
What do you think of the Prince of Egypt, the animated one?
I didn't bother seeing that. I just, some of these things I cannot abide, like these Mary and Joseph as a teen going steady couple and all these things. I just, or even most of the Jesus dramatizations, I just can't stand them. I have a kind of reaction similar to fundamentalists who don't like these movies because they're not strictly biblical. My problem is not that they elaborate, because my favorite Jesus movie is The Last Temptation of Christ, which freely admits it's a very free adaptation, but rather because they trivialize and dumb down the stories in a sickening way. It's just it's a new kind of sickening popular devotionalism, and I just can't abide that. Plus the credulity they foster. It's just I figure, why go through the anxiety? I finally did see the heck was it, the Golgotha Chainsaw Massacre? What was that?
Passion of the Christ?
Yeah. And I was just amazed how unbiblically gory it was. I knew to expect that, though. But beyond that, I felt like, yeah, next this is going to happen, next that's going to happen. How many times do you have to do this? It's sort of like what they call an allegory of reading. The violence done Jesus is like the way they're beating the dead horse of the Gospels to death. Give it up. It's over. It's been done millions of times. Oh yeah, he's going to go to Pilate next, and this is going to happen, and that's going to happen. It's like utterly devoid of any narrative interest. And of course, there's a reason for that. As Tsvetan Todorov, one of the great structuralist critics, said, ancient narrative was simply a set of repetitions, trying to get the same thing across, destroying any suspense, letting the cat out of the bag, whether it's with Jesus or Odysseus and so forth. And that's, oddly enough, that has been what these Bible movies have become. You know just what's going to happen, and the only thing that's different is how stupidly they're going to adapt it. I hate to be so cynical, but it's because I love the Bible that I hate to see it treated like this.
But Bob, I had a friend mention that in a way Mel Gibson might have gotten it right, because obviously Jesus or Christianity might have been a mystery religion. And the point of a mystery religion when you went through the rites was to scare the living Jesus out of you. It just creates so much horror that you would eventually go into a sort of a trance state and eventually see your God or be one with your God as he rises. And it seems, and of course these people in ancient times in the holes and the mask and all that were probably terrified to death, and they thought it was really gory. Maybe that's what Mel Gibson was trying to do, up the ante?
It could be. If so, I commend him for it. I'm not sure that's what... Well, at least the Attis religion did something like that. And it's, of course, being mystery religions, there's very limited access to what they actually thought and did. But that may be the point, and it certainly has Protestant and Catholic audiences weeping through their popcorn as they watch this thing. So it is connecting on that level. I guess I'm too jaded by these movies to pick up on it.
Well, you've always got Jesus Christ Superstar to...
Yeah, now that is fascinating. Well, I think the movie, they must have operated on a budget of about $1.50. I think it's, in many ways, it's badly done, but and because of conscious, idiotic choices by the director, I might add, Weber and Rice wanted it to be like a biblical epic, which is really what it requires, because the non-epic character of it is supposed to provide the contrast. He's a superstar, but he's really confused and so on. But instead, they just have a bunch of hippies doing calisthenics during the triumphal entry, and the Sanhedrin is supposed to be scared of these wimps. It just struck me as just destroying the effectiveness of it. But here I'm just pontificating as if I were a film critic. But I love the musical, which you do not need to see. I mean, just hearing it is good enough. And the stage play originally had an equally inept director. This guy Dan, I think, O'Horgan. And he decided to make it into a science fiction, like a Doctor Who episode, with the Romans dressed as insects from a hive. God. What the hell? And I really blast these guys in my book, Jesus Christ Superstar, Study of a Modern Gospel. And, oh boy. I got Tim Rice to write a brief preface for that. He must not have objected too much to my criticism. Those guys, what a brilliant redactional rewrite of the Gospels that was.
And going to the Gnostics, it's probably good to say, or necessary to say, at least in keeping in the spirit of the show, that the Gnostics were not very keen on Moses for various reasons, right?
Yeah, and that starts in Galatians, which I think comes from the pen of Marcion. At least I think the first two chapters are a Marcionite addition to respond to the book of Acts, which is already critical of Marcion, but I think Marcion wrote chapters 3 through 6, and there we see the germ of the idea that because of Moses' involvement, you can tell the law did not come from God. If it had, he wouldn't have needed a mediator. It must have been that there were two groups. One, the angels who were propagating this stuff to the naive people. And you have the same thing in Colossians, which is just simply Gnostic, I think, where it says that it says don't be involved with angel worship. And what is that? What constitutes angel worship? Keeping the dietary and holiday schedule of Judaism. Wait a minute, how do we jump from angel worship to this? Well, because they were the same thing. The Gnostics thought that the whole of Judaism had been imposed by self-aggrandizing archons. And so that's, I mean, you find it already right there in the New Testament that Moses was a stooge of the demiurge and his henchmen. And they certainly thought they were above these laws. And partly, I mean, that can be seen as a development of the kind of modernizing, assimilationist Judaism of Alexandria, where Philo, who does want everybody to keep the Torah, nonetheless allegorized it because he's sort of embarrassed by all the primitive-seeming, superstitious-seeming rituals, like thou shalt not eat mice and stuff like that. He felt like, well, no, look, it may look silly, but really, here's the allegorical meaning. But that doesn't mean you're absolved from keeping the law in practice, because a lot of Jews were saying, yes, it does. And so it's you're on a continuum there to where you're going to say, oh, the real God didn't even give these laws. I mean, he could no more have cared whether you had a ham sandwich than what kind of wallpaper you use in the tabernacle. You kidding? God is above these things, and we ought to be also. So you can kind of see how the trajectory plays out. So the Gnostic disdain for Moses goes way back. Or how about in 2 Corinthians, where Paul sort of damns Moses with faint praise? So you can see this guy's covenant was inferior and passing away already in his own day because of the veil thing. He knew the glory of that covenant was fading as soon as it started, so he tried to hide the fact, and that's why when Jews or Jewish Christians today read the Torah and think they have to obey it, the veil's still over their eyes. The God of this world, the demiurge, has pulled the wool over their eyes. And so you've got that going on. And Moses says, my ministry is better than Moses, not Jesus' ministry, but mine. I mean, whether this is a historical Paul or a Paul, and it doesn't affect this point, that that Moses is just put in the shade as a kind of a John the Baptist figure, if that. And actually, kind of like the Moonies understood John the Baptist, that he was supposed to be a precursor to Christ, but fumbled the ball. And so there's this increasing disdain for Moses.
To end, Bob, why don't we talk about the end of Moses? Moses, obviously, and again, most people don't know because these movies like the Ten Commandments and so forth just sort of end. But he didn't have a happy ending. As you write, his mob boss, Yahweh, decided he just wasn't going to make it. What are the different possibilities that you put out about how Moses ended? He might not have died. He might have just ascended to heaven, right?
Yeah, because the big punishment was not that he was necessarily going to die before he could get into the Promised Land. It's just that he wouldn't get into it. So why? What happened to him? Did he just kick the bucket, or did he ascend into heaven? Now, Philo and Josephus both believe he ascended into heaven, and either the spiritual body leaving the physical shell behind, or the whole darn thing. I think Philo says the former, Josephus the latter. I could be wrong. But where'd they get this? Well, they probably got it as a pretty valid interpretation of what it says in Deuteronomy, that they buried him, but to this day, nobody knows where. That's kind of like the apologist's argument that the lack of veneration of a tomb of Jesus shows that it was unimportant, that because he didn't stay in it. And you can turn that around and say, well, the lack of a veneration of the tomb early on shows that the whole thing was a myth. But same sort of thing here. Wait a minute. You mean nobody knew where Moses was buried? There was no tomb of Moses? Well, maybe that is a coy way of saying he got buried in heaven. Nobody knows where there's a grave, wink, wink, because there isn't one. I mean, that seems to me to be a pretty sound interpretation. Of course, who knows? And in the New Testament, they seem to have assumed Moses went up to heaven because he appears with Elijah, who did that at the Transfiguration. He appears with Elijah again, or in some interpretations with Enoch in Revelation, and as one of the two witnesses. And neither Enoch nor Elijah died; they went up to heaven. And and then even in Jude, with this thing from the lost book, The Assumption of Moses, it says that Satan and Michael contended over the body of Moses. Now that has to be a reference to this thing where he's smacked the rock instead of spoke to it, and that was enough to make God punish him. It must imply Satan is thinking, hey, this guy was a sinner, he's mine. And Gabriel is saying, oh, no, you don't. Yahweh rebuke you, Satan. He was still, maybe did something wrong, but it was pretty petty, and he's going to heaven. And, of course, the point in the given the title, The Assumption of Moses, is he went to heaven instead of dying. Like Hercules or the Virgin Mary. There's this strong tradition that goes throughout the Bible that Moses didn't die at all. He ascended into heaven, as you'd expect from a sun god.
Oh, and I should have mentioned this while we were talking about movies. I always thought this movie has a very Life of Brian sensibility. Did you ever watch that Dudley Moore movie, Holy Moses?
Yeah, dud is the operative syllable there. I thought there was one funny joke in the thing. What's his name? Dudley Moore's character, the anti-Moses. He's sweeping out the frogs from the store he works in, which is funny in itself. And it turns out the name of the place is chock full of gods. It's an idol store. That I thought was funny. The rest of it, oh boy.
Well, it tried. What are you going to do?
Not very hard. Mel Brooks was better, right, with the 15 Commandments.
Oh, yes, History of the World Part 1, and Moses being mugged by the guy with the crossbow.
I'd forgotten that.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Bob. I'd like to mention first again, for those who want to help Acharya and help her family out, you can go to mythicistmilwaukee.com, or go ahead and, if you want to help, just email me at miguel@thegodabovegod.com. We'll give you links how you can support Acharya's family in this time of need. And once again, Bob, thank you so much for coming on Aeon Byte. It's always a joy, and good luck with your book, Moses and Minimalism.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, Ganesh, forget it. Oh, Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord! Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me! Oh, hear me! All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 15... 10 commandments for all to obey.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media, away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com.